So welcome to the Ending Working Poverty workshop. I'm just going to give everyone a few minutes to rejoin the main session. It looks like we have a great turnout, upwards of 200 people it looks like with us today. My name is Allison Homer. I'm Tamarac's team lead and manager of cities for Cities Reducing Poverty. I'm calling in from the shared unceded territory of the Squamish Nation and the Lillooet Nation, and I'd like to respectfully honor their language, culture, and history. If you have not done so already in recognition of the International Day of Awareness of Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls, I'd encourage you to read the 231 Calls to Justice, which Isaac can copy the link into the chat box. A few technical considerations before we begin. First, the presentation and the panel discussion will be recorded, although the breakout group conversations will not be recorded. Following the event, you will be able to access the PowerPoint presentation, and John noted that the PowerPoint that he presents today is a shortened version of the proposed pathways to ending working poverty, so we'll be sending you the full version afterwards. Please mute your lines when you're not speaking. And if you're having any technical issues, Isaac is here in the chat box and he'll be able to help you out. Let's see, John, if you're able to share your screen.
Yes, I've already shared my screen. Or do I have to redo that again?
I think you have to reopen it.
Oh, you're not seeing it. Okay. Okay. So I have to share the screen, you're telling me. Ending working poverty in Canada. Let me just see that I have the right set of slides. This is the master, as they say. And I'm going to share it. And I am going to play it from the beginning.
Sounds good.
Does that look better? Oh, okay, here we are then.
Yeah, we got it. So for this workshop, we plan to spend about 35 minutes with our speakers. You'll then have 10 minutes to ask them some questions. After that, we'll send you back to the small breakout groups that you networked with a few minutes ago. And at the end, we'll come back, regroup in the main room, and each panelist will provide some closing remarks. So with that, I'm very happy to introduce John Stapleton, today's moderator. John's been working closely with Paul Bourne and I over the last couple of months to articulate the ending working poverty pathways that he's going to share with you today. John is a writer, instructor, and former innovation fellow with the Metcalfe Foundation. He worked with the Ontario government for 28 years in the areas of social assistance policy and operations, and was research director for the Task Force on Modernizing Income Security for Working Age Adults in Toronto. John teaches on public policy for community advocates and is extensively published in local and national media. John, I'll pass it over to you for your presentation and for you to introduce our panel.
Okay, thank you so much. It's quite an honor to be here today. I'm so glad to be invited. After spending the last 12 years doing 3 different publications on working poverty in the Toronto region and also in Canada. And I have just 2 opening comments. One is that we all live on Indigenous land. And the second one is that we can solve working poverty. We don't need to have working poverty in Canada. But you're going to hear about this from the point of view of my particular vocation, which I was a benefit designer, both for government and then after that. So you're going to get it from the point of view of a benefit designer. So first of all, we need to understand working poverty. And The number of people living in Canada living in poverty, first of all, let's look at the overall figure is about 4.1 million people, somewhere around 11%. We've now down to about 10% as of 2020. And of that number, the way I count working poverty, 42% are working poor. So they're the largest single element of the working poverty, of the poverty population. About 2 in 5, 40% of people in Canada receive social assistance of some form or another, either for what we sometimes call basic welfare or for disability supports for people with low income. About 7% of are seniors. Now, under the MBM, only 2% are seniors, but under the LIM, which I use for my reports, and I'll have to change over because now we have an official poverty line called the MBM, but 7% are seniors. Then we have approximately another 7% receiving income from programs like EI and CPP. And then we have about 4% of people that we can never find, and those people live without income support, and often they could be embedded caregivers in families who take care of elderly and kids, but don't actually receive any pay or any income, sort of any. And of course, there are people who are homeless. So under this definition, 42% of Canadians who are in poverty are in working poor. And I use an after-tax income below the low-income measure and have at least annual earnings of at least $3,000, not a full-time student, and living independently. And so the $3,000 threshold is usually above what people would earn on social assistance, but at the same time, it's also the starting point of a program called the Working Income Tax Benefit when it was first initiated, and now it's called the Canada Workers Benefit. So the 3,000 is that threshold. So in global terms, it's possible to say that about 19 to 20 people of working age are not working poor. That diminishes it, makes it sound like a smaller figure. And so different ways of looking at it, looks like a small figure, others are large. But eliminating working poverty is challenging, but obviously not impossible. So across the country, what you're going to see, one of the first things that it's going to look a little bit odd to you is that when we look at various cities, we see that working poverty is mostly increasing, and I have to use the census of 2016. I hope we're all filling out our census over these next couple of days. And but it's our big cities that have the highest amount of working poverty. The richest cities are also the poorest. So I have a riddle, and the riddle is, what is the difference between downtown Toronto and Downton Abbey? So some of you have seen that British show about the aristocracy. And the answer to the riddle is that at Downton Abbey, the working poor were able to live in Downton Abbey. The working poor are generally not able to live in downtown Toronto. But what I want you to know is that it's because of the labor market. And when we have lots of doctors and lawyers and investment bankers and professors and people who make a lot of income, we need a cadre of lower income people who are going to pour their coffee, clean their offices, do their gardening, helping with their childcare and that sort of thing. And that's why we tend to see the most people in working poverty in the service sector in the larger cities, where you see most of the people who are richer. So that's why our richest cities are also the poorest. So let's look at ending working poverty, explain why it's so important and what benefits it could bring. First of all, you need to know that the working poor can be in deep or shallow poverty. And that's because some people are almost over the limit and the poverty limit, and then other people are in deeper poverty. And seniors and children are generally in shallow poverty, and the homeless, of course, and people with disabilities tend to be in deeper poverty. So rates of poverty differ among groups, including levels of income, disability, gender, race, education, etc. And the dilemma of the working poor being in deep and shallow poverty is that there's very little of our government programs that actually go to them while they're working. Only 3, and that's EI working on claim, social assistance, and the Canada Workers Benefit. Everything else you get after you've worked, like CPP, EI, workers' compensation, veterans benefits, etc. So very little is paid to people while they're working, and that's part of this. So almost a half of Canadian poverty would be eliminated if working poor is ended. And some of the benefits is where you face worker shortages in the future after the pandemic will save in healthcare costs, could unclog the court system because of evictions that would no longer be there. Um, then we'd get people in working poverty more into the tax system. Employers would have a reliable workforce. Governments have more taxpayers. Communities would have stronger members, and working poverty would become an oxymoron, which is what we want. So pathways for ending working poverty, there's 4 major pathways, but you'll see there's 13 bullet points there. So I'm not going to read through all the bullet points, but for governments, generally speaking, it's to increase minimum wages, keep child benefits up, working income supplements so that they all work together, reform employment insurance, and disincentivize policies that allow business to declassify employees and make them into contractors. So employers promote full-time work, devise better work that attracts better pay, recognize the value of essential work and pay for it. For the community, fund poverty reductions work at the community level, fund initiatives to include minorities, provide the right support services and infrastructure, plan, educate, and train people. And then for people living in poverty, learn what gets you into working poverty and how you can get out. So the pathways for government, of course, is minimum wages. In Ontario, for example, it's $14.25 an hour. And you can see that heading up along that continuum, that when we have living wages like in Hamilton or in other areas of the country, we take people out of poverty, and we certainly take families out of poverty. So we need a minimum wage of at least $15 across Canada for that. So before the pandemic, EI was unresponsive, asymmetrical, unfair, and out of date. So we learned that during the pandemic that EI couldn't rescue us, and we needed the pandemic responses. And going forward, we're hoping that employment insurance will be reformed to actually deal with the workforce that we have in 2021. The last big changes cutting back EI were in 1994. So one thing a lot of people don't know is that Canada is at the bottom when it comes to strictness of employment protections and hiring regulations, and right at the bottom in rich countries, and strictness of dismissal regulations. Canada is one of the easiest countries to fire someone. And yet I think Canadians, certainly I know that we walk around often smug, thinking that we're better than other countries, but in this whole area of protecting workers amongst the rich countries of the world, we are bottom dwellers. So we can fix that. Pathways for employers, I just want to center for a second on tenure and hours of work. Look at that green box, full-time, full year, and out of poverty. A single person right now who is working full-time, full year at 37.5 hours, at least in Ontario, is $30 above the MBM poverty line. So we really need to be vigilant across Canada to make sure that our amounts are kept up, and our taxation is not too invasive, in order to make sure that people still, if they're full-time, full year working, that they're for sure out of poverty. Pathways for community, the right supports as we train the future labor force, and public-facing service delivery providers, educators, and social service providers can do more. Supports and services, statutory change, all are important and mostly organized around political decisions and around those budgets. So stay vigilant about your budgets, and few take decent work into account, and they both could and should. So for fund poverty reduction work at the city level, community work needs funding. I'll let you read the left-hand side of the slide as I simply say, launch a local campaign to end working poverty, launch local living wage campaigns, and connect to provincial networks that you can see given as examples, recruit, certify, and recognize local employers, celebrate them who are paying living wages, and join and support local, provincial, and territorial decent work initiatives. Cities reducing poverty. I'll let you once again read the left-hand side of the page talking about continuing Tamarack City's reducing poverty initiatives on a number of different scores, but we give the example of the Winnipeg Poverty Reduction Council, WPRC here, that have come together to educate corporate management, support corporate management and educate their workforces about Indigenous history and its legacy, and then facilitating new connections between employers and Indigenous job seekers. So looking forward, what do we want to do? We have federal goals. We know that the federal legislation talks about reducing poverty by 20%. By 2020, which they have already done, but they did that by taking a lot of people out of the shallow end of poverty. But as you look at the poverty pool there, you'll see that we have to reduce poverty by 50% in 2030 to meet our millennium goals and to meet our legislative goals. And the 2030 goal will be much harder to do. And so that means that we have to look at people who are living in deep poverty and get them out of poverty too, not just people who are in shallow poverty. So I'll leave it at that. I think I'm right on 2:25 right now, and I will try to stop share my video and head over to the question and answer section of this. And what I want to first do is to introduce my fellow panel members. Tristan Johnson. Tristan is a senior planning analyst with the City of New Westminster in British Columbia, and his work spans many different areas, including housing, poverty reduction, and data analysis. And my other fellow panelist is Kumsa Baker, and Kumsa is currently the Director of Community Benefits campaigns at the Toronto Community Benefits Network. Through his work, Kumsa supports Toronto neighborhoods in organizing for equitable local economic development through community benefit agreements on large-scale urban infrastructure and development projects like the Eglinton Crosstown LRT, Light Rapid Transit, West Park Healthcare, and the Toronto Community Housing Commission Corporation's Regent Park revitalization in downtown Toronto, and something called Casino Woodbine Expansion. That's where they have the Queen's Plate. He also leads community benefits policy advocacy at all three levels of government. So my first question to both Kumsa and to Tristan are, what are your initial responses to the elements of this proposed pathway, the 13 elements in those 4 different fields, to ending working poverty? Which measures would you like to reinforce, and do you have anything that you would like to add? So we'll start with Tristan.
Sure. Thank you very much, John. So I agree with the pathways. Increasing minimum wage is very important. It'll make it easier for the working poor to make ends meet. I think that taking that one step further, more employers should commit to paying their employees a living wage, which is higher than a minimum wage and takes into account what full wages are needed to have a basic standard of living. At the City of New Westminster, we have had a living wage policy in place, not just for employees, but for contracted services for the city since 2011. It has not hurt our ability to attract bids to work on city projects. Many employers across Canada in different sectors have committed to paying their employees a living wage. I just wanted to bring up one thing missing from the past way that we need to discuss: paid sick leave. The health emergencies of the COVID-19 pandemic and the drug toxicity death crisis have shown some of the tragic consequences of a lack of paid sick leave. For example, workers who can't afford to take much time off of work taking street drugs and narcotics to keep pain in check so that they can keep working, leading to addiction and sometimes death. Workers who go to factories despite being sick because they have no sick leave and end up infecting other workers who bring the COVID-19 virus home to their families, with family members and workers sometimes dying. Currently, only 2 provinces, Quebec and PEI, have paid sick leave requirements for all workers. And even there, these provisions are quite limited. Only 1 paid sick leave day in PEI and 2 in Quebec. After immense political pressure, Ontario has recently introduced legislation that will provide up to 3 days of paid sick leave, but it's only for COVID-19 and it's only a temporary measure. Furthermore, even though the Government of Canada did respond to sick leave concerns during the pandemic with the Canada Recovery Sickness Benefit, the payments are usually not high enough to make up for lost wages. Although the pandemic will end, people spreading illnesses at workplaces will not end, nor will people having chronic pain. Therefore, we need to support people to be able to take the time they need to recover from illness or treat pain without penalizing them. The lack of paid sick leave is quite pervasive, as 53% of workers in BC, for example, do not have access to paid sick leave, including 81% of workers earning under $40,000 a year, 89% earning under $30,000. So the COVID-19 pandemic has brought this issue into the focus. So now is the time to encourage our provincial and federal governments to mandate minimum paid sick leave requirements. Thank you.
Thanks. Over to Kumsa.
Thank you, John. I think you laid out a really great pathway, for us to really think about. For me, I really want to stress the focus on decent work and good minimum wages or livable minimum wages. For me, my first job was as a food service worker, working here in Toronto at the Sky Dome, making hot dogs and pizza. And for me at the time, I was in high school, so it was a great seasonal job. But what it really did was it opened up my eyes to those who are working, on the front lines, in these type of service type jobs. And a lot of my colleagues, were youth, newcomers, women, and racialized people. And some people working 2, 3, or even 4 jobs, just to make some of the ends meet. And, in my workplace, one of the ways that we took power was forming a union. And having a vision to say that service sector jobs can be good jobs with job security, access to benefits, access to a pension, and to pressure our employer, which is Rogers, to pay its fair share. I feel that ending poverty in Toronto is something that I'm deeply committed to. I've seen firsthand in my community the rise of living costs, cost of living, that have really pushed people out of the city and even worse, people onto the streets and into homelessness. And one of the actual grassroots campaigns that I've been really inspired about is the Fight for 15 in Fairness here in Toronto, who were able to mobilize, in communities, across the province in 2017 to apply pressure, on the provincial government to say that we need to raise the floor for working people. And actually being able to get a significant win by raising the minimum wage by over $2.40 an hour to $15. And at the time, we heard from a lot of really big employers saying that, the sky would fall down, that businesses would have to lay off staff, that, they would have to defer hiring, or that automation would take people's jobs away. But that in fact didn't happen, and looking at the stats, from the year after the new minimum wage was implemented, there was actually a positive overall job growth in Ontario, so that sky actually didn't actually fall down. And what it actually reminded me was that mobilizing in community at the local level, to really grasp the attention of decision makers, to demand more and to see more leadership from governments to raise the floor for workers. And even though the current Ford government rolled back some of these, changes to minimum wage and paid sick days, recently we saw a good response from the federal government, as part of the 2021 budget to ensure that there is a $15 minimum wage for all federally regulated industries and businesses. And we've also saw businesses from their own who've come forward and are acknowledging the importance of treating its workers fairly, committing to paying a living wage, covering the costs of its workers for paid sick days. And I think that through this pandemic, I think, which has disproportionately, really impacted, folks who are in low wage jobs, in service sector jobs, especially here in Toronto, because we're such a large service based economy, that many of those folks are Black, Indigenous, and racialized folks. And it's going to be important to continue to mobilize at the local level to really challenge our governments to ensure that we end poverty once and for all. And actually by providing the necessary basic income supports, that we've been able to provide to folks during the pandemic, and to also ensure that there are livable wages and decent working conditions for everyone.
Thanks very much, Kumsa. I have a second question now for our 2 panelists, and that question is, what are the most important roles that the organizations that you work for, and with municipal, private, and or business, should play in advancing in ending this overall working poverty pathway? So Tristan, we'll hand it back to you.
Sure. Thank you, John. So there are 3 ways that municipalities can advance ending working poverty. 1, leading by example, 2, advocating to higher levels of government, and 3, by supporting nonprofit organizations. As a municipal government, we don't have the same level of money or funds as higher levels of government do. We don't have the same policy levers that the higher levels of government do. But what we can do is lead by example. In 2011, New Westminster became the first municipality in Canada to adopt a living wage policy. Now, 7 other municipalities in BC alone have become living wage employers. By being bold and adopting this policy, we show that, yes, this can be done. With our success with living wage and it not impacting our ability to have contractors bid on city projects, other municipalities can see that they can do it too. Even before we became a living wage municipality, the majority of city employees already made a living wage, and some of the contracted services did as well. So perhaps the number of people directly impacted by the city of New Westminster becoming a living wage employer was not that high. However, by leading by example, which encouraged other municipalities and other employers to adopt a living wage, the number of people who received a living wage was increased. What municipal governments can also do is advocate to higher levels of government about working poverty. Advocacy can make a difference in many areas. I'm going to use an example that's not about working poverty, but still shows an example of the importance of advocacy. Back in December 2018, the BC Poverty Reduction Coalition connected with the City of New Westminster's Community Poverty Reduction Committee and went before City Council to ask the City Council to endorse the All on Board campaign for free transit for children and youth, among other things. City Council endorsed this campaign. As part of the 2021 BC budget, the BC provincial government has proposed to make public transit free for children 0 to 12 years old. As this shows, it may take time, sometimes years, for requested changes to become a reality. But if enough people and groups ask for change, you can still affect change. Therefore, I would recommend for organizations and municipalities to advocate to the provincial and federal government to make changes that will reduce working poverty, including mandatory paid sick leave provisions that I discussed in my first answer. So my final thing municipalities can do, and I'm sure there's more, but in the interest of time, I'll just mention these 3, is to support nonprofit organizations that are providing programs related to reducing working poverty. This support can range from researching statistics for their grant applications to providing additional support in kind, such as cities providing venues for events related to the programs, which is obviously more applicable in non-COVID times. Cities can also write support letters for nonprofit organizations that are trying such programs. Thank you.
Kumsa, we're over to you now for the second question.
Awesome. Thank you, John. So I'm going to speak a little bit about the current work that I do with my organization, which is the Toronto Community Benefits Network. We're a Toronto-based community labor coalition that has just around 120 members. And we are a coalition of community organizations, grassroots community groups, social enterprises, labor unions, construction trade training centers, and workforce development agencies. And the goal that we have as a coalition is to ensure that, as we see lots of investments, coming into infrastructure, and here in Toronto specifically, we have billions of dollars that are being invested into things like affordable housing, things like transit. Also now with the whole sort of shift towards green infrastructure, that we want to make sure that as those investments are being made by government, that we see an equitable approach to ensuring that who are getting those economic opportunities, right, and making sure that whether it's in the skilled trades or also some of the professional, administrative, and technical positions that are being created, that it's equitable and really supports many of the underrepresented groups that we've seen, including women, Indigenous, Black, racialized peoples, at-risk youth, and newcomers. And at the TCBN, we foster partnerships across all sectors, including labor, government, and private sector, to negotiate community benefit agreements that commit to equitable and local hiring. And amidst a pandemic, where we see a focus on building back better, or what I would like to say, building back differently, with a focus on groups who we know have been disproportionately been impacted by the pandemic, right? And especially with like some of the low wage sector jobs, and service sector jobs, that have been most impacted by the pandemic. What are the opportunities that we see in terms of the changing economy, and with all of these investments in public infrastructure, is there an opportunity, to retrain or reskill workers, ensuring, while also ensuring equity, and supporting, folks getting into good jobs, good union jobs with pension and benefits. And so, really working collaboratively with labor to identify an equitable approach, to recruitment, to hiring, as part of, as these new infrastructure investments are being made. And one of the core, pieces of our work is also around advocacy. And so, we really, put a lot of pressure on government because, we recognize that government has a lot of power in its purchasing and procurement, especially here in Toronto. I think it's, in the billions of dollars every year that's spent on purchasing and procurement. And, what are ways that we can leverage, that purchasing and procurement to promote decent work, to promote, good jobs, in our communities, to also think beyond just the physical infrastructure, right? A lot of times that's really the focus is, how can we build, the transit that we need, to support growth. But what we also need is the social infrastructure to also support that growth. Things like community hubs, community spaces, childcare centers, those are all key investments that also need to be made into communities. And so, really, putting pressure on governments to think about that, as, these investments are being made is really important. And here in Toronto, we've been, working, as a coalition since around 2010 and formalizing in 2014 as a coalition to really see this work as part of our poverty reduction strategy. So as part of the Toronto poverty reduction strategy, there is a focus on looking at, procurement and purchasing, during the consultations, one of the key things that we heard, from community members that the best path out of poverty was actually a good job, and so, from that poverty reduction strategy, we're able to adopt a social procurement policy in 2017. And then further in 2019, a community benefits framework policy that looks at, many of the municipal investments that are being made, the different tax breaks or tax incentives that are, being given to developers to say, if we're going to be giving you tax breaks, what are the ways that we can work with you to promote good jobs and decent work within our communities? And then also the private sector, that's governments are making a lot of investments in infrastructure, but it's the private sector that are actually building out these projects, and so, working with the private sector, recognizing things like, shortage of workers, of skilled workers, which is something that we have heard in the construction industry specifically, from, the contractors associations or the building trades, in terms of the need for workers in the near future. And, how can we, work with them in terms of addressing, that gap that is coming forward, and also to make sure that, those opportunities are being, shared with the community, that, we have training programs in place to help, get people the skills they need to be able to work on these projects. And then also, I think now with the pandemic, there's a huge focus on ESG policies, whether it's environmental, social, or governance policies from the private sector, especially public companies. And so, how can we really leverage that as well to, say that, if you're focused on, ESG, we see community benefit agreements as one tool to make sure that there's a commitment to that, in sort of the communities that you're working in, to make sure that, the workers, your employees, those who are in management positions, those people who are on your board, that they should reflect the diversity, of the communities in which you're working in. And then at the community level, lastly, I think, I mentioned about training, so making sure that there's, outreach, and to help support people in understanding, the changing economy, where those, new opportunities may be created, education, making sure that, if folks need, any skills or education to help, help them shift into sort of the new economy or some of the new careers or opportunities that we see being created through infrastructure. And how can we do that engagement and training, with some of our nonprofit providers as part of our network, and social enterprises who also, provide training and supports. And so, yeah, I think it can't be left to one sector. I think, strong partnerships and collaborative approach, is the way to go in terms of, help making sure that, as we're building better, as we're building back better, that we're also building back differently. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kumsa. Now I'd like to get from all of the 151 participants a nice round of applause for all of us. So thanks very much. Now what I'd like to do is to get into your questions. This is one of the most important parts of this. And so I'd like to introduce my research associate, Yvonne Yuan, who's the only other member of the tiny policy consultancy of Open Policy Ontario. So we're a bit of a team here, and she has came from China, and she very recently got her permanent residency, and she hopes to be working in one of those good full-time jobs fairly soon, and also undertake further studies while she's here. So Yvonne, welcome. And what questions do you have for us?
Okay, thank you, John. We got a bunch of them. The first one is a quick question for John. Carrie Nolan. Carrie noted that some data was not available for the territories. I saw that questions regarding the NBM data. When are you expecting that data to be available in the near future? Actually, I think I'm able to answer parts of that because I'm the one who made that chart. Currently, the NBM data are not available for Nunavut, Northwest Territories, and that's kind of a developing northern NBM measurements. According to the website, they will have a new paper on the proposal in mid 2021. So soon, I assume soon we'll hear something new about it. But unfortunately, at this point, I don't know when we can get this data.
Okay, thank you. What's
and do you have anything to add? Or no? Okay, we'll move on to the next one. This is for all of you. A question from Franco and Lynn. Please comment on the common negative response that increasing minimum and living wage as well as assistance rates lead to higher costs, which prevents the poorest to improve their circumstances.
Well, I'll start off and say I think we should be in a high wage, high cost environment. You often get people saying, well, it's very difficult to people to conduct business if they have to pay a living wage. I would be as radical as saying that maybe they shouldn't be in the business if they're not able to pay a living wage in the first place. And I think that Canadians, certainly we saved $200 billion during the pandemic. We got lots of money to spend, and if prices go a little bit higher in support of people's living wage, that's a good thing. Over to Tristan or Kumsa.
Sure, I'll just take a shot at it. And I just tell employers to think about their employees and how it's to the employer's benefit as well. Like, think about if you pay your employer a minimum wage versus a very low minimum wage versus a living wage. That employer might not be able to afford to take their medication, which means they're going to be off sick more often. That employer might be more stressed about money, which may affect their productivity at work. If you're an employer and you pay your employees poorly, it'll hurt you as an employer. Your employees might be more stressed. They might end up feeling, and that'll take a lot of toll. And also, if you pay them well, you send a message that you value them, and it will motivate them. And I think it benefits everyone to pay a higher wage from that point of view. You need to think about your employees more as people and an asset, rather than just some cog in the wheel that you throw in like a production cost or a line item.
Kumsa, do you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I think I totally agree with both of your points, so I won't go into too much detail. But I definitely agree. I think there needs to be that, I think, support for workers in terms of raising living wages. And in terms of cost, the one point that just came back to mind was that costs have been increasing, for so long, and our wages haven't been able to meet the rise of living, of our cost of living. And so I think because of that piece, I think costs are going to continue to rise. And I think with that, I think we need to see our wages also, match that and continue to rise.
Okay, what's the next question?
Okay, next one is also for all of the panelists, and it's also regarding the living wage. How do you challenge the message from small businesses that they cannot afford to pay more than a living wage?
Tristan, you want to take that one?
Well, I'd say to go to the living wage website of Canada and look at what they have to say and their different arguments. And then if they think, oh, that's just, that's what they're just giving propaganda or whatever to, I challenge them to follow up with other companies in similar sectors that are paying a living wage and find out firsthand how it's benefited them. That's probably the best way, is to just hear how it's improved the lives of employees and improved the performance of other companies that offer a living wage. So that's what I challenge them to do.
Kumsa, do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I would have to agree with Tristan. I think there are, companies that are paying living wages to their employees and are being successful. And, the return on that investment, I think is out there. I think there's research around that piece. And so, I think investing in your employees can have long-term returns.
Hey, thanks. I think we have time for one more question. We're at 2:51.
Okay, well, I have a question for Kumsa. How do we reach workers who may not know what their rights are, and how can we help them organize? I think other panelists can also weigh in as well.
Yeah, I think for me, it's just, starting at the local level, right? And, within my own community, right? Whether it's at home, with my neighbors, with my friends, I think a lot of times that's, where the conversations start. And, I think as community, I think there is an opportunity to support, workers who are out there, who have challenges or struggles. I think, even here in Toronto, there's a rising gig economy, of workers, and so, what are the responses that community can come forward with to help support, with those who are, on the front lines, and we even saw just even recently in the pandemic, with, our frontline heroes, in terms of, our community, being in solidarity and supporting and recognizing the value of our frontline workers, of those who are, risking their health, to provide the services that we need. And so I think we're in a moment where we can really capture that, and to really push and to say that, if we really value these workers, during a pandemic, how do we make sure that we value them, long-term and, even out of a pandemic, because, they're really essential to our system and to, helping our economy.
Yeah, Tristan, do you want to weigh in? We only got about a minute left. So.
I'd say probably Kumsa nailed it. He's got most of the answers and he has more expertise in this particular area. So I'll leave you with his response there.
Okay, Yvonne, we got time for just one more to squeeze in.
Okay, so please comment on the role of financial wellness and financial literacy programs in ending working poverty. Who wants to start?
Sure, I'll start. So actually, as part of the community poverty reduction committee that we have in New Westminster, we have a financial literacy subcommittee. And that's huge. It helps in so many areas. Just there's this program in the area called the Financial Navigator, and just helping people stretch their dollars, because let's face it, in a lot of the cities and even some of the rural areas in this country, even if you're middle class, it's sometimes hard to kind of make a go of it. So finding what benefits you're eligible for, finding out how to budget, all those things are key. So the first thing, I guess, is you lift the wages enough so people have money. And then the second thing you got to do is help them use their money efficiently and not get taken in by scams, payday loans, all those sorts of things. And so financial literacy is really key. And I really hope, because when I was going to school, they didn't really teach us that much about it. And fortunately for my kids' generation, it seems like they're teaching them about budgeting and stuff. So I think really through the schools, I think it's really important at a young age to learn about how to best use money and make good decisions and know what's a scam and know what benefits and stuff are available to you.
And it's also important that while we're teaching people how to navigate the maze, that we're getting, that we're also shrinking the maze, because it often gets larger and larger as we teach people about it. So anyways, we're at the 2:55 point I can see on my little timer here. So I'm gonna turn it back over to Allison to take us to the next step.
Okay, I'm following the chat right now. From Jennifer, get creative and leverage existing benefits or salaries or incomes level when possible. From Estelle, oh, that's from my group. We will understand the importance of living wage and also meaningful representation in groups tackling poverty issue, which is the meaningful engagement of people who have lived experience of poverty. Group 12, from Group 12, encouraging business in the private sector to communicate with one another and leverage one another's knowledge. Advocating for migrant workers and temporary foreign workers, sharing tangible financial tools and resources like tax preparation with community networks, not forgetting how unprepared we were for the pandemic, and continuing advocacy for robust income support. Thank you, that's okay. I see a lot of living wage from Erin, revisiting living wage campaign, working closely with Chamber of Commerce, explaining social development is as important as economic development. From room number 2, importance of living wage, how to encourage employers to pay a living wage, which is the business case for a living wage, getting businesses to talk about businesses that have done a living wage already. Oh, there's a lot on living wage. Okay. From
I'm seeing them come up too, and there's a
yes,
living wage. I think that's going to be there.
Yes, living wage. It's I think it will be the biggest part of today's takeaway. Oh, okay, I see. I'm just running a glance through. From Laura, our group discussed how do you battle a large international company that puts a lot of resources and effort into making things like unionization not happen. Basic supports can drive wage higher, so that the only option is to raise wages. We need to intentionally plan to build back better or differently. We need to articulate what this looks like. If we don't, there's a push to return to normal. And we also has a need for a local context of poverty.
Yeah, Yvonne, I think we're going to have to leave it at that and not necessarily get every group on, but we can see
there's a lot of great discussions here.
So I think what I'd like to do now, give the remaining 10 minutes from 3:15 now to 3:25 when I hand it back to Allison, is to get both Tristan and Kumsa to reflect on what they've heard and ask you your closing thoughts and your recommendations, and I'll get an opportunity to provide my own. So this time we'll start with Kumsa.
Awesome. Thank you, John. I think from what folks have shared, I think, really captures a lot of the current moment of the pandemic, in terms of the disproportionate impact that it's had on, our Indigenous, our Black, our racialized folks, women, folks who are working, on the front lines. And, I think there are roles that, governments can play, their roles that the private sector can play, and their roles that the community can play in terms of, collectively, raising the floor, for workers, for people who are experiencing poverty. And I think, like, with the shift to green infrastructure, lots of investments going into development, especially in some of the urban centers like Toronto, I think is going to create lots of opportunities, and I think, like, if there are ways where we can bridge that gap in terms of where we see those opportunities, but with, where we're seeing some of the challenges in our communities, and really leverage, this moment, to help, reskill, retrain workers, to get some of those, new opportunities, that are going to be created. And so, yeah, I think it was a really, thought-provoking, discussion, for me. And so, yeah, I really thank everyone for contributing and being part of a really great and important discussion today.
Thanks a lot, Kumsa. So Tristan, over to you. You're on mute. You're gonna have, I think you're on mute, Tristan. No. Can we technically unmute him?
Sorry, my mouse got lost. It must have been chasing some cheese or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
Sorry, guys. Yeah. Well, my just takeaway was I was, blown away by, all the work that Kumsa's organization does. And, I think in government, we can do a bunch of stuff and do policy, but it's really inspiring to see stuff at the grassroots level and to see people being active and proactive. And I think that's the takeaway, is that everyone can play a role in this, and this matters to everyone. I think that's my main takeaway, whatever sector you're in, whether you're a business, whether you're a nonprofit, whether you're just a regular resident, whether you're a policy analyst, whether you work at a city, I think there's something that we can all contribute. So I think that's really cool.
I'll just give a few remarks of my own. Earlier, I talked about the 3 programs, the 3 income security programs that people can access while they're working. And there's just the 3. And that's the employment insurance working on claim that the current government has put a few $100 million into. And then you have the social assistance programs in all the provinces and territories, sometimes called income assistance, sometimes called social assistance. And then you have the specific program that in the federal budget that's just going to be increased, called the Canada Workers Benefit. But let me tell you that I can absolutely promise you that the policy makers in the employment insurance program at the federal level and the policy makers in social or income assistance programs at the provincial and territorial level, and the staff and the policy makers at Finance Canada and the Canada Revenue Agencies, I don't think I've ever set foot in a room where all of them were together. And the reason I can tell you that is because each of those programs acts like they're ships in the night, and they all, I can only put it one way, I'm going to use this verb anyways, is they all cannibalize each other. For example, social assistance will, after somebody earns a few bucks, will start to deduct the money off social assistance. Well, what does EI working on claim do? EI working on claim says that half the income that somebody earns through their wages is reduced off their EI. So what happens if social assistance or income assistance is taking 50% of the dollar and EI working on claim is paying 50 cents on the dollar? Well, that's 100%. But what does social assistance then come back and do? It comes back and it reduces employment insurance by 100% on the dollar. And not to be outdone, then the Canada Workers Benefit reduces itself on the basis of something called adjusted family net income, the dreaded AFNI, as those of us who deal with these sorts of things. And what the program does is then take the EI that someone gets and the social assistance they get and counts it against the amount of the Canada Workers Benefit. So I've seen many people thinking that they're going to get the full $1,300 in the in that program, and only to find out that they're eligible for nothing. Why are they eligible for nothing? Because they already get EI and they already get some social assistance. So these programs all look at each other and they're all hovering around each other, trying to figure out ways to deduct the other one. And so the poor person who's at the other end of that, who's have their social assistance deducted, their EI deducted, and then their Canada Workers Benefit, these guys and gals need to sit down in a room and figure out how to design the only sets of programs that provide income security to people who are working and working at low wages. And that's something that we could really do a lot better in Canada. So I'm just looking out now, seeing that we got a couple of minutes left, and if there is any other last comments that Tristan, Yvonne, or Kumsa would like to make. If not, well, we might actually, oh, somebody asked, would a universal basic income address this problem? Well, of course it would. I mean, the issue is, especially for a lot of people in labor, are a bit wary of a universal basic income, because then they think it lets employers off the hook. And so if we were to provide people with an absolute amount of income that's going to meet all their needs, then employers are going to think about ways that why should they pay salaries in the first place to people. Not that a basic income is not a good idea, and it's especially good for people living in poverty. And I think we can all agree with that. But we do have to figure out what the responsibilities of employers are, as well as the responsibilities of government. So that's exactly what we're going to face, especially with the UBI. So we do have to think of those large corporations that like to spend very little money on labor, and how we're going to fit that in with a government-led basic income. Allison, we are at 3:24, so we're less than a minute. So maybe it's about time to hand things back to you.
Thank you so much, John. Thank you to Yvonne, Tristan, and Kumsa. This was such a full discussion and so many incredible takeaways. I might ask attendees, just before you leave this workshop and shift into the next sessions, on the house-based workshop page for Ending Working Poverty, if you can leave a one-word reflection, we are going to use those to visualize takeaways to create a word cloud. So that would be on the house-based page, Ending Working Poverty, one quick one-word takeaway in that as well, if you're able to. So we now have 30 minutes before our next workshops. So feel free to take a break. Some recommendations are go outside, stretch, go for a walk. If you learn in a different way, you can consider meditating on what you've heard, journaling, drawing, visiting our Take a Break page for ideas. I will also offer you the opportunity to go directly into your next workshop. I know basic income just came up. That is in the next round, and I know it's quite popular. So it might be a good idea if you have a workshop you especially want to attend. They will be capped, so you can always enter the room early and just put yourself on mute, turn your camera off, and take your break. But that way you'll know you have a spot for the session. So Isaac has copied those links into the chat if you want to visit your next Zoom room directly. Thank you so much again to all of you and to our panelists, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the event.
Thanks.
Thank you.